I'm Ethan, 33 years old, and up until recently, I thought I had my life figured out. My dad, Mark, has been my mentor and business partner for over a decade. At 65, he spent most of his life running a small diesel mechanics workshop, a place I've been attached to since I was a kid. Growing up, I loved helping him tinker with engines on the weekends, and it became clear early on that I wanted to follow in his footsteps. That's why I went to college to earn a degree in automobile engineering. I wanted to bring something extra to the table, something official to show how serious I was about contributing to the family business. I joined the workshop full-time at 23, back when it was a modest operation with just 2 part-time mechanics and a single truck. Over the next 10 years, I poured my heart and soul into that place. With my dad's mechanical expertise and my ideas for modernizing the business, we turned it into something remarkable. We grew to 35 employees, expanded our fleet to 15 vehicles, and skyrocketed from $250,000 in annual revenue to nearly $7 million this past year. It wasn't just work for me, it was a legacy. I thought about the hours I spent there not as sacrifices, but as investments. Late nights, early mornings, endless stress. All worth it, because this was our family's future. I envisioned taking the reins fully one day, carrying on the work my dad and I had done together. But then there was my older brother, Jason. He's 39 now and an accountant who's been living in the city for years. Unlike me, Jason never showed any interest in our dad's workshop. He used to hate it, actually. As teenagers, he'd call it embarrassing that our dad was a mechanic, and he'd make fun of me for enjoying the work. I remember him yelling at me once, calling me ridiculous for wanting to follow in our dad's footsteps. Jason thought my career choice was a waste of potential and told me as much, often. It didn't seem to matter to Dad, though. Jason was always the favorite. Growing up, I told myself it was just because Jason had been through a lot when he got pneumonia at 15. He was bedridden for months, and it was a scary time for our family. Dad spent countless nights by his side, and they became close in a way I could never quite replicate. Even after Jason got better, that closeness didn't fade. It became clear as we grew up that Jason could do no wrong in Dad's eyes. As I got older, I began to notice the little ways Dad favored him. One time, I won a big academic award in high school and invited my parents to the ceremony. Mom was ecstatic, but Dad hesitated. He already had plans to play basketball with Jason that day. Mom had to pressure him to change his plans and come to support me. In the end, he promised he'd be there, but he never showed. I remember standing on that stage, scanning the crowd for his face, only to go home and find out he'd taken Jason for ice cream instead. Even so, I told myself it didn't matter. Actions speak louder than words, right? And Dad's decision to bring me into the business, to let me help him transform it, had to mean something. For a while, I thought it did. I thought wrong. For years, I told myself that Dad's favoritism toward Jason wasn't personal. Jason needed him more back then, I thought. But the truth became harder to ignore as time went on. While Jason went to college and lived his flashy city life, I stayed behind, working long hours at the workshop. And despite how much I contributed to the business, turning it from a small garage into a thriving operation, it always felt like I was chasing validation that would never come. Jason, on the other hand, had Dad wrapped around his finger. He'd barely step foot in the workshop unless he needed a favor, but that didn't stop Dad from treating him like the second coming of Einstein. Jason was the golden child, and everyone in our family knew it. Even Mom, though she tried to balance things out, couldn't fully hide her frustration. I remember one conversation with her, not long after Jason came home for the holidays. He'd just gotten a promotion at his accounting firm, and Dad wouldn't stop gushing about it. It was as if Jason had single-handedly discovered fire. Meanwhile, I'd just secured a major contract with a fleet company that doubled our revenue projections for the quarter. When I told Dad, he gave me a polite nod and said, "That's great, son," before turning back to Jason to ask about his new office. That night, Mom pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Ethan," she said softly, resting a hand on my shoulder. "I know it's hard sometimes with your dad and Jason, but I see how much you've done, even if he doesn't always say it." Her words were kind, but they didn't erase the sting. I loved my dad. I wanted to make him proud. But how could I compete with Jason, when Dad had already decided he was the one worth celebrating. I didn't let it stop me. If anything, it fueled me to work even harder. Over the years, I dedicated myself to building the workshop into something both Dad and I could be proud of. We expanded, bringing in more staff and equipment, and I implemented new strategies that modernized our operations. It felt good to see our business grow, even if Dad rarely gave me the credit. That brings me to last year, when everything began to change. My parents' marriage had been on shaky ground for a while, but when Dad announced he was filing for divorce, it still hit me like a freight train. Mom didn't seem surprised. She even told me later that she saw it coming years ago. But I struggled to wrap my head around it. It wasn't just about the divorce itself. It was about what came after. Dad started dating a much younger woman named Gina. She was 30, just 3 years younger than me, and to be honest, I wasn't sure what to make of her. She was polite enough the few times we met, but something about the situation felt off. I tried to stay out of it. It was Dad's life after all, but Gina's presence only seemed to widen the gap between us. Suddenly, Dad was more concerned with impressing his new wife than focusing on the business we'd built together. Then, about 5 months ago, Dad invited Jason and me to dinner, saying he had something important to discuss. I went, expecting some kind of announcement about retirement, or maybe even a new direction for the company. What I got instead left me reeling. "I wanted to tell you both that Gina and I got married," Dad said with a proud smile, like he was expecting us to cheer. Jason and I exchanged a look, both of us too stunned to speak. Dad continued, oblivious. "And with that, I've been thinking a lot about the future of the business." My stomach knotted. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment where all my years of hard work would pay off. I leaned forward, ready to hear him say it, that I would take over the company when he retired. Instead, he turned to Jason. "I've decided that Jason should inherit the workshop." I froze. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. Jason? Jason, who had openly mocked the business for years. Jason, who wouldn't know a socket wrench from a screwdriver. Jason, who didn't even want it. Dad kept talking, explaining how Jason needed it more because he had a family to provide for. "You're not married yet, Ethan," he said, as if that somehow made me less deserving, and I believe Jason can take the business to new heights. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. All those years of work, the sacrifices, the loyalty, it meant nothing. My hands tightened into fists under the table, but I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "Dad," I said slowly, trying to process his words. "I've been here every step of the way. I helped you build this business. How can you just give it to Jason?" Dad didn't flinch. "You'll still have your job," he said. "You can work under Jason, but the business is going to him." It was like being punched in the gut. I turned to Jason, hoping for some kind of support, but he just avoided my eyes. That hurt almost as much as Dad's betrayal. I left that night feeling like everything I'd worked for had been ripped away, but I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. After that dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. It wasn't just about the business. It was everything. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like an afterthought had come crashing down in that one moment. I kept replaying Dad's words in my head, each time feeling the sting a little sharper. For days, I didn't call or visit. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I couldn't stay. The workshop wasn't just a job to me. It was my life's work. I had poured my heart and soul into that place, not for a paycheck, but because I believed in what we were building. And now Dad was asking me to step aside, to hand it all over to Jason, who couldn't care less. Staying would mean working under someone who didn't respect the business or the people who kept it running. That wasn't something I could stomach. I called Mom that weekend and told her everything. She listened quietly as I laid it all out. The favoritism, the announcement, the betrayal. By the time I finished, she sounded as upset as I felt. "I can't believe he did this to you," she said, her voice trembling. "Ethan, you've worked so hard. You've earned that business." "Apparently that doesn't matter," I replied bitterly. "It's all about Jason. It always has been." Mom was quiet for a moment, Then she said something that shifted my perspective completely. "You've done amazing things, Ethan. You don't need the workshop to prove that. If your dad can't see your worth, maybe it's time to show him by building something of your own." Her words stuck with me. I'd always thought of the workshop as my legacy, but maybe she was right. Maybe I didn't need Dad's approval or his business to succeed. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this define me. If Dad wanted to hand the business to Jason, fine. But I wasn't going to stick around and watch them run it into the ground. Over the next few weeks, I quietly started reaching out to clients. Most of them were people I had personally brought into the business, longtime partners who trusted me. I explained the situation, letting them know I was leaving to start my own company. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Many of them expressed shock at Dad's decision, but more importantly, they pledged their support. "You've always been the one we trusted," one client told me. "Wherever you go, we'll follow." Hearing that gave me the confidence I needed to take the leap. I'd saved up enough money over the years to get started, and with the support of loyal clients, I knew I could make it work. The hardest part was handing in my resignation. When I walked into Dad's office with the letter, he looked up at me, confused. "What's this?" he asked, taking the envelope. "My resignation," I said simply. His eyes narrowed. "You're quitting? Why?" I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was racing, because I can't work here anymore. "You made your choice, Dad. Now I'm making mine." For a moment, he just stared at me, his face a mix of shock and frustration. Then he slammed the letter down on his desk. "You're being selfish, Ethan. The family business needs you." I almost laughed at the irony. "The family business?" I said, shaking my head. "You mean Jason's business. You made it clear I don't have a place here anymore." Dad tried to argue, but I didn't let him. I walked out of that office feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. It wasn't easy at first. Starting a business from scratch is daunting, even with experience, but I was determined. I worked tirelessly, building a team and setting up operations. My focus was on providing the same quality and reliability that had earned me the trust of our clients in the first place. Word spread quickly. Within months, my new company was thriving. More than half of the workshop's clients had followed me, and even some of Dad's employees reached out, asking to join my team. It was bittersweet to see how quickly things fell apart at the old workshop, but I couldn't bring myself to feel guilty. Dad, however, wasn't taking it well. I started getting texts from him, long, guilt-ridden messages accusing me of abandoning the family and sabotaging the business. Jason chimed in too, blaming me for everything that was going wrong. At first, I tried to ignore them, but one day, Dad sent me a particularly nasty message that ended with, "I hope you're happy watching your family fall apart." That was the breaking point. I blocked both of them. For the first time in years, I felt free. The weight of their expectations, their favoritism, their manipulation, it was gone. And in its place was a determination to prove to myself that I could thrive without them. Blocking Dad and Jason gave me the space I needed to focus entirely on my new business. It wasn't easy. Starting from scratch rarely is. But with the support of loyal clients and a small but dedicated team, we began to find our rhythm. I poured every ounce of my energy into making this venture a success. Early mornings turned into late nights, but I didn't mind. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. This was mine. Every decision, every success, every setback, it was liberating. Within a few months, the company was thriving. Our client list grew steadily, and the positive word of mouth spread quickly. People appreciated the level of care and professionalism we brought to the table, something that had been my hallmark even back at the old workshop. Meanwhile, news of the original workshop's struggles started trickling in. Jason was completely out of his depth. He might have been a decent accountant, but running a mechanics workshop was an entirely different ballgame. He didn't understand the operations, the relationships, or the intricacies of managing a team of mechanics. Clients were leaving left and right, many of them citing frustrations with the lack of organization and declining quality of service. A few of my former colleagues who had stayed on called to vent about how chaotic things had become. "Jason doesn't even show up half the time," one of them said. "When he does, He's barking orders about stuff he doesn't understand. It's a mess. I wasn't surprised, but hearing it still stirred something in me, a mix of sadness and vindication. I didn't want the old workshop to fail. I had spent a decade of my life building it after all. But this was exactly what I had warned Dad about. Then came the fallout. My mom called me one evening to share the latest development. Dad was in trouble. He had to sell the workshop, she said. The business was bleeding money, and with Gina leaving, he couldn't keep up with the bills. That caught me off guard. Wait, Gina left? She took what little money he had left in the divorce, Mom explained, her tone laced with a mix of frustration and sympathy. Ethan, your dad is struggling. He's even asked family friends for loans. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt bad for him, but another part couldn't forget how easily he had cast me aside. This wasn't my mess to clean up. Not long after, Dad reached out again. He called, texted, even emailed, begging me to come back. His messages were laced with a mix of regret and guilt-tripping. Ethan, one text read, we need you. The family business needs you. Please come back and help fix this. I couldn't help but scoff. The family business? That ship had sailed the moment he handed it over to Jason without a second thought. Jason wasn't any better. He called me out of the blue one afternoon, his tone accusatory. You've ruined everything, he said. If you hadn't poached all the clients, none of this would have happened. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice calm. Jason, the clients followed me because they trusted me. If you'd taken the time to build relationships with them, maybe they wouldn't have left. He didn't have much to say after that. Still, their combined attempts to guilt me into coming back left me emotionally drained. Blocking them had been a temporary reprieve, but now their desperation was seeping through the cracks again. Mom, as always, was my voice of reason. Ethan, she said during one of our many talks, you've done more than enough. They made their choices and now they're dealing with the consequences. You don't owe them anything. She was right, of course. I didn't owe them anything, but letting go of the guilt and resentment wasn't as simple as flipping a switch. Through it all, my girlfriend Maya was my rock. She'd been with me for over a year, and her unwavering support was exactly what I needed. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, she was there to remind me of how far I'd come. One night, as we sat on the couch after a long day, she turned to me and said, "You've built something incredible, Ethan. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve it." Her words struck a chord. I realized then that I couldn't keep letting Dad and Jason's issues weigh me down. I had a life to live, a business to grow, a relationship to nurture, and a future to look forward to. That's when I made a decision. I would confront Dad one last time, not to reconcile, but to make it clear that I was done with the drama. It took me a week to prepare for the conversation with Dad. I wasn't going in for closure. I knew better than to expect that. But I needed to lay everything out and make my position clear. I was done with the back and forth, the guilt trips, and the never-ending drama. Dad called me over for dinner one evening, and when I arrived, I wasn't surprised to see Jason there too. The air was thick with tension the moment I walked in. Jason sat at the table with his arms crossed, avoiding eye contact, while Dad looked tired and older than I remembered. "Ethan," Dad began after a few awkward moments. "I'm glad you came. We need to talk." I nodded and sat down, keeping my expression neutral. "All right, let's talk." He exchanged a glance with Jason before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I realize now how much this family has fallen apart. I regret some of the decisions I made, and I want to fix things." For a split second, I thought he was finally going to apologize. But then he dropped the real reason for the meeting. "I need you to come back to the business," he said, his tone more firm than pleading. "You're the only one who can save it." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "Dad, there is no business to come back to. You sold it, remember?" "That's not the point," he snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Jason's struggling to get back on his feet, and I'm not in a position to help him. If you hadn't taken all the clients, we wouldn't be in this mess." There it was. The blame. The same tired narrative that everything was somehow my fault. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. "Dad, I said slowly. I didn't take the clients. They chose to follow me because I built relationships with them. That's what you never understood. It wasn't about the workshop or the name on the building. It was about trust. Something you handed away the moment you pushed me aside for Jason. Jason finally spoke up, his voice dripping with resentment. You're just trying to rub it in, aren't you? You think you're better than us because you're doing well now. I turned to him, my patience wearing thin. No, Jason. I don't think I'm better than anyone. But let's be honest. You never wanted the business. You only took it because Dad handed it to you on a silver platter, and you thought it would be easy. That's on you, not me. Jason looked away, muttering something under his breath, while Dad sighed heavily. I'm tired of this fighting, he said. Ethan, you're my son. I don't want to see this family torn apart anymore. Can't you just put the past behind us and come back to help? I stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. For years I had craved this acknowledgement, some sign that he valued me, that he saw my worth. But now, it was too little. Too late. Dad, I said, my voice steady, you're asking me to clean up a mess I didn't create. I spent 10 years building that business, and you gave it away without a second thought. You made your choice, and now I've made mine. I'm not coming back. He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop him. You wanted me to work under Jason, to take orders from someone who doesn't understand the first thing about running a workshop. That's not a partnership. That's a slap in the face. I've built something new, something I'm proud of, and I'm not giving it up to fix your mistakes. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Jason shifted uncomfortably, while Dad looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Finally, I stood up. I didn't come here to fight, I said. I came to tell you that I'm done. I wish you both the best, but I'm moving on with my life. With that, I walked out of the house, leaving them to deal with the consequences of their actions. As I drove home, I felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and a sense of finality. For years, I had carried the weight of their expectations, their favoritism, and their constant disregard for my efforts. But now, I was free. When I got home, Maya was waiting for me. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. How did it go? She asked softly. It's over, I said simply. I told them I'm done, and I meant it. She smiled, her arms tightening around me. Good. You deserve better. For the first time in a long time, I felt like she was right. The weeks after that final conversation with Dad and Jason were some of the most peaceful I'd experienced in years. For the first time, I felt like I was living on my own terms, unburdened by the weight of their expectations. Blocking their numbers wasn't an easy decision. It felt drastic at first. But as time went on, I realized how necessary it was. My business continued to thrive. New clients kept coming in, drawn by our reputation for reliability and quality. A few of my former colleagues from the old workshop even reached out, asking if I had positions available. They'd grown frustrated with the chaos under Jason's management and wanted to work somewhere where they felt respected and appreciated. It felt good to be able to offer them a fresh start, just like I'd given myself. Slowly but surely, my new company was becoming everything I'd envisioned, a place where hard work was rewarded and relationships were built on mutual respect. Mom remained my biggest cheerleader throughout it all. We talked often, and she made a point to remind me how proud she was of what I'd accomplished. You've always had it in you, Ethan, she said one evening over dinner. It's just a shame your dad couldn't see it until it was too late. Her words were bittersweet. I couldn't deny that part of me still wished things had been different with Dad. But I'd learned the hard way that some relationships can't be mended, no matter how much you want them to be. Jason's situation, on the other hand, had gone from bad to worse. Word got back to me through family friends that he'd abandoned the workshop altogether and was trying to get back into accounting. The business had been sold to another company, but by then, there wasn't much left of it to save. As for Dad, he wasn't doing much better. The divorce from Gina had taken what little money he had left, and without the workshop to rely on, he was struggling financially. I heard he'd moved into a smaller apartment, and was relying on support from friends and extended family to get by. A part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but I couldn't ignore the choices that had led him there. He'd put Jason on a pedestal for years, ignoring the warning signs and dismissing everyone who tried to help. It wasn't my responsibility to pick up the pieces now. Meanwhile, my life was moving in a direction I hadn't expected. Maya and I had grown even closer over the past year, and I'd started to realize that she was more than just my partner. She was my anchor. One night, as we sat on the couch planning our next vacation, I found myself blurting out the words I'd been holding back for weeks. "Maya, will you marry me?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I'd caught her completely off guard. Then she smiled, her face lighting up in a way that made my heart race. "Of course I will," she said, pulling me into a tight hug. It wasn't the most elaborate proposal, but it felt right. Natural, like everything else about our relationship. With Maya by my side and my business flourishing, I finally felt like I was in a place of stability and happiness. The struggles with Dad and Jason were still a part of my story, but they didn't define me anymore. Looking back, I realized how much I'd grown through it all. I'd learned to stand up for myself, to trust my instincts, and to build a life that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. As I sat in my office one morning, going over plans for a new expansion, I found myself smiling. The road to this point had been full of twists and turns, but I wouldn't change a thing. Every challenge, every betrayal, every hard decision, it all led me here, to a life I could truly call my own.